So in these videos, I'm going to take a look at every single Super Nintendo wrestling game, and there's a lot of them, so I'm only going to spend about a minute on each of them. And in this first video, I'm going to look at the American wrestling games, and of course I'm going to start with WWF Super WrestleMania. This was the first wrestling game I played on the Super Nintendo, and it was also the first in a series. This is a pretty straightforward button mashing game. Every wrestler in this game fights pretty much exactly the same, and there are no signature moves. Funny thing though, the Sega Genesis version of this game does have signature moves. The Sega Genesis version also features a couple characters you won't find in this game, and vice versa. But most notably, the Sega Genesis version has the Ultimate Warrior. So considering that the Sega Genesis version has signature moves, and a cooler roster in my opinion, it makes the Genesis version a much better choice. In regards to modes, this game only offers one-on-one, tag team, and Survivor Series. And for those of you that don't know, a Survivor Series match is a 4-man elimination match. And this game is really just a button masher. You just walk up to your opponent and push those buttons as fast as you can. So WWF Super WrestleMania doesn't offer a whole lot, but it was a pretty early game and it was rather entertaining for its time. Fortunately though, the later releases were a lot more entertaining to play, so I would go ahead and sit this one out and just play the others. Moving on, the successor to this game is WWF Royal Rumble. This game was released a year later in 1993 for the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo. So this version runs faster, we have a larger roster, we now have the signature moves, and the Royal Rumble mode has been added. Royal Rumble mode allows up to 6 characters on the screen at once, and your goal is to throw all the opponents outside of the ring. Another mode added into this game was Brawl, which is an old term for hardcore match. Brawl is a no-rules match where you just beat up your opponent until they're all out of energy. Like Super WrestleMania, the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo version of this game have a slightly different cast of characters. Funny thing though, they only put Hulk Hogan on the Sega Genesis version. You'd think they would have put him on both. So when comparing the two ports, the Super Nintendo version has a better color palette, and of course the Super Nintendo control is much easier to use than a 3-button Sega Genesis control. Really the only reason I like the Sega Genesis version is because it has a slightly better cast of characters. But ultimately, I guess you gotta say the Super Nintendo version is better. And moving on, I'm gonna touch on the last wrestling game to use this engine, WWF Raw. This game came out a year later in 1994 for the Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, and Sega 32X. Not a whole lot was done to change the gaming experience itself. It really just has a handful of small changes that make it better than the last release. In regards to modes, they only added one new mode, Bedlam. Bedlam is essentially a tag team tornado match with no rules. Each character now also has their own stats, so some characters are faster while other characters are stronger. And the game itself also runs a little bit faster. And also a new addition, not only does each character have a signature move, but they also have a super move. And these super moves are not just really strong wrestling moves, they're maneuvers human beings cannot do. So they're silly but pretty entertaining to watch. And one thing though, I never actually pulled one off. They're very difficult to do. I've only seen the computer do them. So I definitely enjoyed this game, but Royal Rumble had some charm you won't find in this one. Moving on, I'm going to look at WWF WrestleMania the arcade game, which was developed by Midway. So this game was released on the Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, 32X, Sega Saturn, PlayStation, Arcade, and PC, and I played them all. Unfortunately though, the Super Nintendo release of this game is the worst one. It's missing 2 characters, Bam Bam Bigelow and Yokozuna, and it has major slowdown issues. More so than a wrestling game, this is just a fast fun fighting game, and it shares several elements with Mortal Kombat, as it was developed by the same people. I already took a look at this game for the Sega 32X, so if you want my thoughts on the gameplay, just go ahead and watch that video. But like I said, this is the worst version of this game. I would recommend any other version than this one. Moving on, I'm going to take a look at the only WCW game during the 16-bit generation, WCW Super Brawl. This game was released in 1994, the same year as WWF Raw. I always found this character select screen really strange, but entertaining. When I first played this game, I thought it was complete crap, but playing it now, I actually kinda like it. The problem with the Acclaim wrestling games is they were button mashers. This one takes a little more strategy. In fact, this game could be rather frustrating if you don't know what you're doing. I mean, look at me go, I'm just beating some ass. When it comes to modes, this game only offers one-on-one and tag team mode, so it doesn't offer a whole lot in that department. So each character has the same moves with exception to the signature move, but you can do a lot more wrestling moves in this game than you could on the WWF games. So this is a pretty entertaining wrestling game, but you really gotta learn how to play it, otherwise it'll be a little frustrating. And in regards to wrestling games released in America, this is really one of the few that doesn't just feel like a beat 'em up. This is a real wrestling game. I won't recommend this for everyone, but I enjoyed it. Moving on, now I'm going to show you Saturday Night Slam Masters, which was one of my all-time favorite arcade wrestling games. It originally hit the arcades in 1993 and was released on the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis in 1994. Now, both ports do a pretty decent job at bringing us the arcade game, but the Super Nintendo definitely did it better. Not surprisingly, the Super Nintendo version has better graphics and audio over the Sega Genesis port. And the biggest problem with the Sega Genesis port is it only offers one-on-one versus mode. Yet the Super Nintendo version offers up to 4 characters on the screen at once, and this is really the best way to play it. So in regards to gameplay, it's really not much of a wrestling game. It feels more like a beat 'em up. In fact, a good way to describe it is Final Fight with a pin button and more grapples. So in regards to gameplay, this is very true to the arcade game. However, the arcade just has much better graphics and audio. And if you want more of my thoughts on this game, go ahead and look at my Saturday Night Slam Masters review for the arcade. Moving on, I'm going to take a look at Natsume Championship Wrestling. And this game is actually the American release of Zen Nippon Pro Wrestling, which was released in Japan. The Zen Nippon Pro Wrestling games use the All Japan Pro Wrestling license. This, however, does not use any license. And if you want my opinion, this is really a great wrestling game, one of the best we saw on the Super Nintendo. However, since it didn't use a license, no one cared about it. Just like Fire Pro Wrestling, the grappling system in this game is based on timing. So button mashing in this game isn't going to do you a lot of favors. When it comes to modes, it really comes down to one-on-one and tag team, so not a whole lot in that department. There's about 12 different characters in this game, and each have their own maneuvers. So like I said, this is definitely an entertaining wrestling game, and one of the better ones we saw here in America. The AI in this game is really easy though. You can beat them by just doing the same maneuvers over and over again. So Zen Nippon Pro Wrestling offers the All Japan Pro Wrestling characters, however in regards to gameplay, it's exactly the same. And the last American wrestling game I'm going to look at is Hammerlock Wrestling. And this was also released in Japan as Wrestle and Romance, which is the gayest title ever for a wrestling game. And I'm going to go ahead and be blunt about this one. I really hate this game. I hate the control, I hate the presentation, and frankly, it just runs too damn slow. Someone had the bright idea to put these animations at the top and bottom of the screen of what your character is doing. However, it just seems to make the game go really slow. Like it makes a punch take too damn long, it makes a maneuver take a little while to do. I just hate it like this. And like Fire Pro Wrestling, the grappling system is also based on timing, so you gotta push the button at just the right time. However, I just cannot figure out when that goddamn timing is. So I played this game quite a bit just trying to get the hang of it, but the control is just too awkward for my taste. So without getting too into this game, I'm just gonna recommend you not play it. So those were all the Super Nintendo games released here in America, but there's still a bunch more released only in Japan, so be sure to look at my next videos.